The afternoon sun hung low over Los Angeles, washing the Forrester estate in a deceptive warmth that could not reach the frost that had settled inside Steffi's heart. She had returned from Europe expecting peace, a fresh start after months of distance and therapy, a reunion with her husband that might restore what had begun to fade between them. But peace was never meant for people like Steffi Forrester. The moment she stepped back into her home, she felt it, that subtle fracture in the air, the uneasy silence between words, the hesitation in Finn's eyes whenever she drew too close. It was the silence of guilt, the kind that clings to every breath, every touch, every lie carefully disguised as reassurance. Finn had been distant for weeks before her return, claiming exhaustion, long hours, the pressure of surgeries that demanded every ounce of his focus. Steffi, hardened by years of betrayal and survival, tried to suppress the unease growing inside her. She told herself that love meant trust, that after everything they had endured, he wouldn't risk what they'd built. But denial is a fragile kind of faith, and it shatters easily under truth. The truth didn't come from Finn's mouth. It arrived in the form of a trembling young woman, her eyes dark with desperation, her hands clutching a small envelope as if it were her last defense against madness. Steffi had just finished a conference call when the woman appeared at her door. Her name was Mara. She was a nurse at the same hospital where Finn worked, and her face was pale, nearly translucent with nerves. At first, Steffi thought she was there on hospital business, perhaps a message about Finn's schedule. But the moment Mara spoke, the ground beneath her shifted. The words came haltingly, heavy with shame. Finn. Affair. Pregnant. Pleading for Steffi to walk away so that she could have him. For a heartbeat, Steffi couldn't process the meaning. It was as if the world had gone mute except for the pounding of her own pulse. She heard only fragments, the way Mara's voice broke when she said he threatened me, the tremor when she confessed that Finn had begged her to stay silent. The room began to spin, the light too bright, the air too thin. Steffi stood there frozen, her mind splintering between disbelief and memory. She saw flashes, Finn's tired eyes the night before she left for Europe, the hurried goodbyes, the vague excuses about double shifts. The pieces she had ignored now rearranged themselves into a cruel picture. Mara's words cut through every illusion she had clung to. The image of her husband, the man she had defended against everyone, now dissolved into something unfamiliar and repulsive. Mara continued to speak, her voice breaking under the weight of confession. She claimed it hadn't started as an affair, that Finn had been vulnerable, overwhelmed by stress, by loneliness, by the emptiness Steffi's absence had left behind. What began as sympathy had slipped into intimacy, and one mistake had spiraled into many. When she discovered she was pregnant, she had gone to Finn, hoping he would take responsibility, that he might even choose her. But instead, Finn had turned cold. He demanded she terminate the pregnancy. He had even threatened her career if she spoke to anyone, especially Steffi. But secrets have a way of rotting the soul, and Mara could no longer bear the weight. By the time she finished, Steffi's body had gone numb. Her voice, when it came, was sharp and brittle, a shard of glass ready to cut. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She simply told Mara to leave, not because she doubted her, but because she needed to breathe before the storm broke loose. When the door shut behind the woman, Steffi's legs gave out. She sank to the floor, shaking uncontrollably, her mind a battlefield of disbelief and rage. For years, she had fought to rise above betrayal, first from Liam, then from those who tried to shatter her family. She had endured heartbreak, loss, and humiliation. But this betrayal, this wound, came from the one man she had believed incapable of such cruelty. Finn, who had saved her life, who had sworn he was different. The man she had trusted to rebuild her sense of safety. The irony was almost poetic. The healer had become the destroyer. When Finn came home that evening, Steffi was waiting. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock, each second dragging like a blade across time. He smiled when he saw her, that familiar gentle smile that once melted her defenses. But now it only fueled her fury. She asked him about his day, her tone deceptively calm. When he began to speak, some harmless account of rounds and patients, she interrupted him with a single question that sliced the air open. "Who is Mara?" The way his expression faltered was all the confirmation she needed. He tried to hide it, to regroup, to turn the question back on her. But Steffi's eyes burned with the kind of clarity that terrifies liars. She pressed harder, naming the hospital, the nights, the threats. Each word tightened the noose around his composure. Finally, Finn broke, not with confession, but with excuses. He called it a mistake, a moment of weakness, an accident. He said it meant nothing. But to Steffi, it meant everything. It meant that every "I love you" had been contaminated, every promise tainted. When she asked about the pregnancy, his silence screamed louder than any admission. Finn begged her to understand, to forgive. He claimed fear had driven him. Fear of losing her, fear of scandal, fear of destroying their family. But fear is no shield for betrayal. Steffi saw not the frightened husband he claimed to be, but the coward who had destroyed 2 lives with a single choice. Her anger erupted, sharp and raw. Years of suppressed pain poured out. Every lie, every broken vow, every sacrifice she had made to keep her family whole. She accused him not just of infidelity, but of arrogance, the arrogance of believing he could play God with other people's lives. For days afterward, the house became a graveyard of silence. Finn tried to reach her, to explain, to undo the damage with empty gestures. But Steffi was beyond reach. She moved through their home like a ghost, her once vibrant presence hollowed out by betrayal. She stared at the family photos lining the walls, each one now a relic of a life that no longer existed. When she looked at Finn, she saw not her husband, but a stranger wearing his face. Meanwhile, the world outside went on as if nothing had changed. The hospital continued its rhythm of births and deaths. Colleagues whispered behind closed doors. Some pitied Finn, others condemned him. But no one truly understood the scope of what he had done, not just to his marriage, but to the fragile trust that held his world together. Mara, ostracized and fearful, filed for leave. Rumors spread that she planned to leave the city entirely. Yet before she disappeared, she sent Steffi one final letter, an apology, and a promise that she would raise the child alone. It was not meant to hurt her further, but it did. It reminded Steffi that the betrayal had consequences that would never vanish. The night Steffi decided to end her marriage, the sky mirrored her turmoil. Lightning split the horizon, rain striking the glass in furious rhythm. She packed her things quietly, methodically, each folded garment a small act of defiance. Finn stood in the doorway, helpless, watching the woman he loved turn into someone he could no longer touch. He tried once more to plead, to swear that he would change, that he would spend the rest of his life proving his remorse. But Steffi didn't want remorse. She wanted truth, and he had buried it too deep for too long. Her final words to him were simple, stripped of emotion. "I will not live with a man who hides behind fear." And with that, she walked away, leaving him in the wreckage of what he had destroyed. In the days that followed, Steffi felt both liberated and hollow. The Forrester mansion became a refuge, yet even there, she couldn't escape the echoes of his voice, the scent of his cologne lingering in her mind. She buried herself in work, in her children, in anything that reminded her she still had control. But healing is a slow process, and betrayal leaves a residue that time alone cannot erase. Late at night, she would stand by the window, staring into the darkness, wondering how something as sacred as love could curdle into something so cruel. Finn, on the other hand, unraveled quietly. He continued to work, to smile for appearances, but beneath the surface he was rotting from guilt. The hospital that had once been his sanctuary became a place of torment. Every hallway, every patient reminded him of the life he had shattered. He replayed that night in his mind endlessly. The first kiss, the moment of weakness, the instant he crossed the line from doctor to sinner. He had thought he could control it, conceal it, but secrets have a way of demanding exposure. And now, with his marriage in ruins and his reputation tainted, he began to question not just his choices, but his very identity. The media caught wind of the scandal soon after. Gossip columns whispered about the downfall of the perfect doctor, the Forrester princess betrayed once more. Photos surfaced, Steffi leaving the courthouse, her face unreadable, thin at the hospital, shoulders slumped. Public sympathy fell on Steffi, but even the admiration of strangers couldn't fill the void. She had loved him fiercely, believed in him completely, and that made the betrayal unbearable. Mara's pregnancy advanced quietly in the shadows, far from the glamour of the Forresters. Though she had once sought Finn's love, she no longer wanted anything from him. The child inside her became both her punishment and her redemption. She told herself she would raise it alone, that one day, perhaps, it would never need to know the man who had denied its existence. Yet in her darker moments, she couldn't help but imagine what might have been if Finn had chosen differently, if fear hadn't turned him into a monster. Months later, as the divorce proceedings began, Steffi felt the first flicker of peace. She realized that sometimes strength is not in holding on, but in letting go. She no longer needed to prove anything, not to Finn, not to the world, not even to herself. She had survived too much to be defined by another man's weakness. And yet, beneath the steel of her resolve, there remained a sliver of sorrow. Not for what was lost, but for what could have been. Finn's final attempt at redemption came on a rain-soaked evening when he arrived at the Forrester mansion, uninvited. He was drenched, trembling, his voice breaking as he confessed everything again, not just to Steffi, but to Ridge, Taylor, and everyone who would listen. He begged forgiveness, not for reunion, but for peace. But forgiveness is not something that can be demanded. It must be earned, and sometimes it can never come. Steffi listened in silence, her eyes filled not with hate but with a calm, distant pity. When he finished, she simply turned away. It was over. In the aftermath, life moved on in fragments. Finn transferred hospitals, retreating from the spotlight. Steffi returned to work, her strength admired by those who saw only the surface. But deep within, she carried the memory of that betrayal like a scar, invisible yet permanent. She learned that love can be both a lifeline and a weapon, that the same hands that heal can also destroy. And somewhere across town, Mara gave birth to a daughter. She named her Hope, a name that felt both ironic and necessary. When she held the child for the first time, she thought of Finn, of Steffi, of the chain of choices that had led to this tiny heartbeat in her arms. She whispered an apology to a world that had been torn apart by her confession, and a promise that her child would never know the pain that created her. As the years would pass, the scandal would fade into whispers, then into memory. But for Steffi, the lesson remained carved into her soul. Love without truth is just a beautiful lie, and sometimes the only way to save yourself is to let the illusion die. On quiet nights, she would stand by the ocean, the same ocean that had once reflected her happiness, and listen to the sound of waves breaking endlessly against the shore. Each wave was a reminder of endings, of beginnings, of the inevitable rhythm of loss and renewal. And though her heart still ached, it also beat with strength, with clarity, with the fierce understanding that she would never again allow someone else's weakness to define her worth. The ocean air carried a deceptive calm that Thursday morning, wrapping the beach house in a veil of serenity that no longer existed inside its walls. Beneath the hum of the waves, the storm that had once been Luna Nozawa's mind began to crack and splinter under the weight of jealousy, regret, and a desperate hunger for control. While the rest of Los Angeles drifted through another unremarkable dawn, Luna's world had narrowed to a single image, a photograph on Will Spencer's social media feed, tagged with the words "New Digs." It was meant to be harmless, a casual announcement, perhaps even a symbol of renewal. But to Luna, it was an open wound, bleeding with betrayal. The picture showed Will standing outside a half-finished beach house, sunlight bouncing off his smile, and beside him, the unmistakable silhouette of Electra Forrester. To anyone else, it was a simple scene. To Luna, it was proof of abandonment. Ever since her incarceration, time had become viscous. The days stretched endlessly. The walls seemed to pulse with whispers of memories she wanted to destroy. There had been a time when Luna believed she could heal, that her love for Will was the one force capable of pulling her out of the chaos she had created. But isolation did not soften her edges, it sharpened them. The silence of her cell only amplified the sounds of her own thoughts, looping endlessly through what-ifs and half-truths until they took on the shape of madness. She told herself that love was still alive between them, that if she could only get out, she could make him see it. And so, when she saw that picture, every restraint snapped like glass underfoot. The rage came quietly at first, a slow burn beneath the skin, a whisper telling her that she had been replaced, that her name had been erased. The guards saw nothing but a woman staring too long at a torn magazine clipping, her lips moving in silent argument with ghosts. But within her, something was forming, a plan, a pulse, a reason to live again. She would not be the forgotten one. She would not watch from behind bars while the man she had built her dreams around constructed a new life on the ashes of their old one. Meanwhile, miles away, the sea breeze caressed the terrace of that very beach house. Will and Electra stood in the morning light, unaware of the darkness gathering just beyond the horizon. For weeks, they had been rebuilding something fragile, not just a home, but a sense of peace that had long eluded them. Electra had been patient, though her patience was often laced with guilt. She knew Will still carried the echoes of Luna, the woman who had once enchanted him, broken him, and haunted him in equal measure. Yet she also knew the power of time, of gentleness, of routine. Together, they had painted walls, unpacked memories, laughed over burnt pancakes, and allowed the rhythm of ordinary life to fill the gaps that passion and pain had once occupied. But even as the ocean glittered before them, something unseen began to stir. That night, long after Will fell asleep to the sound of waves crashing against the rocks, Electra found him scrolling through old photos of Luna, of the chaotic months that had led to her downfall, of a love that had burned too bright to last. He didn't speak when she entered, but she could feel the ghost of Luna between them, as tangible as the salt air. He shut off his phone quickly, muttering something about closure. Electra pretended to believe him. What they didn't know was that the house they now called their sanctuary was about to become a battlefield of energy, both literal and spiritual. Rachel Riley, the once vivacious bartender from the bikini bar, had long since transformed her life. She was no longer serving cocktails or casual gossip. Now, she served what she called energetic purification. To her, spaces carried memory. Every heartbreak, every argument, every betrayal left a residue that clung to walls like invisible dust. She had been called to cleanse the beach house by Katie Logan herself, who had sensed that something about the place, and about Will, still felt haunted. When Rachel arrived, her presence was both calming and unsettling. She wore white linen, her hair loose, her eyes steady, the kind of steadiness that made others question their own. She spoke softly about vibrations, about the way trauma attaches itself to objects. Bill Spencer, standing at the doorway with his skeptical half-smile, tried not to laugh when she began lighting sage. But even he couldn't deny that the air seemed to shift, that the heaviness lingering since Luna's downfall began to lift slightly. Liam, more introspective than his father, watched Rachel with quiet interest, wondering if healing could be this simple, or if it was all just theater for broken hearts. For Rachel, however, this was not a performance. As she moved through the rooms, she felt it, a pulse of something restless. The house, though new, carried an unease that didn't belong to the living. When she reached the upstairs hallway, the temperature dropped. She paused, her eyes closing as if to listen. In that silence, a whisper formed in her mind, not words, but a feeling, obsession. The kind that doesn't die even when it's caged. She knew, though she didn't say it aloud, that Luna's energy was not gone. It was waiting. And in a sterile cell several miles away, Luna was no longer waiting. The guards discovered the missing key card at dawn, the faint scent of disinfectant and bleach masking her escape route through the infirmary. It had taken weeks of manipulation, a whispered promise to a young nurse, a feigned breakdown, a moment of chaos perfectly timed. When the alarms blared, Luna was already gone, her prison clothes discarded behind a dumpster, her new identity clinging to her like armor. The world thought she was broken. They were wrong. She was focused now, colder, sharper. Every heartbeat brought her closer to the man who had tried to erase her. The following day, the ocean seemed to rise in anticipation. Rachel stood at the edge of the patio, burning sage once more as the sun sank below the waterline. Will and Electra sat nearby, unaware of how close danger had come. The evening was warm, almost too calm. Electra spoke about paint colors and flower arrangements. Will nodded, his gaze distant, his mind haunted by something he couldn't name. Then, without warning, the power flickered. The house plunged into darkness. Rachel froze. Her eyes widened, her body tense. It wasn't the blackout that frightened her, it was the sensation that followed. A cold wind swept through the house, carrying the faintest echo of laughter. Not joyful laughter, but the kind that chills the spine. The candles Rachel had lit trembled violently before snuffing out. When the lights returned moments later, the living room door swung open by itself. Electra gasped. Will's face turned pale. The next morning, the police confirmed what Rachel already knew. Luna Nozawa had escaped custody. The news spread quickly across Los Angeles, dominating headlines and sending a ripple of fear through everyone connected to her past. Katie and Bill immediately doubled security at the beach house, but Will resisted. He insisted that Luna would not come for him, that she was too smart, too far gone. But deep down, a part of him wasn't sure. He remembered the way she used to look at him, as if he were both her salvation and her curse. He remembered how she once said she would rather die than live without him. Rachel, sensing the unease, began her rituals again, but this time her words carried an urgency she couldn't hide. She spoke of spiritual warfare, of cleansing not just the home, but the souls within it. Liam offered to stay and help, though he couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was the lingering belief that energy, no matter how invisible, could destroy as much as any weapon. As night fell again, Luna stood at the edge of the cliff overlooking the beach house. From there, she could see everything: the glowing windows, the silhouettes moving inside, the laughter that drifted faintly through the air. She had imagined this moment for weeks, rehearsed every step in her mind. She wasn't here to kill anyone, she told herself. She was here to reclaim what was hers, her life, her truth, her love. But even she could feel the tremor of instability beneath that resolve. The lines between love and vengeance had long since blurred. She waited until the early hours before slipping through the unlocked side gate. The scent of salt and sage hit her like a memory. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the glass door, the same door she had once walked through with Will's arm around her waist. Inside, everything looked too perfect, too clean. It enraged her. She stepped quietly through the hall, her breath shallow, her eyes scanning for him. Upstairs, she could hear voices, Rachel murmuring something about energy flow, while responding with polite skepticism. For a moment, Luna almost smiled.
He hadn't changed.
He still doubted everything he couldn't control. The confrontation, when it came, was not loud. It was haunting in its quietness. Luna appeared in the doorway like a shadow made flesh, her hair loose, her expression unreadable. Will froze. Rachel's incense stick fell from her hand, extinguished in silence. Electra turned pale, her heart hammering in her chest. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Luna spoke, her voice low and trembling with conviction. She didn't demand forgiveness or plead for understanding. She declared love, absolute and terrifying. She spoke of destiny, of promises made under starlight, of the energy that bound them beyond reason. Rachel, sensing the madness woven into her words, stepped forward cautiously. She spoke softly, trying to reach the remnants of the woman beneath the obsession. But Luna's eyes were glassy, fixed only on Will. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, time fractured. Luna reached out, her fingers brushing the air between them as if it could bridge the chasm that years of pain had carved. Will whispered her name, not out of love, but out of shock, pity, perhaps fear. That pity shattered her. She had escaped, risked everything, only to find that he looked at her like a stranger. Her world imploded in that instant, her rage consuming the fragile boundary between reason and chaos. Rachel, acting on instinct, began chanting softly, her voice steady even as the energy in the room seemed to thicken. She didn't believe in evil in the traditional sense, but what she felt then was close. The air grew heavy, the candles flared, and for a moment, everyone could feel it, the weight of Luna's obsession pressing down on them like invisible hands. When the police arrived hours later, Luna was gone again, vanished into the night, leaving behind shattered glass and the echo of her final words, "We're not finished." Rachel, exhausted, collapsed onto the couch, her body trembling. Will and Electra clung to each other, but the illusion of safety had been destroyed. They knew she would come back. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a waiting room for fear. Days later, Rachel returned to finish the cleansing, though this time she came alone. She walked through the empty rooms, her voice barely above a whisper as she invoked peace, closure, release. But as she reached the upstairs hallway once more, she paused. The air was still cold. The energy, faint but unmistakable, lingered. She smiled sadly, realizing that some spirits, no matter how much you try to banish them, never really leave. And so the ocean kept its secrets, the waves erasing footprints as quickly as they were made. To the outside world, it was just another scandal fading from memory, a celebrity romance gone wrong, a fugitive lover lost to the sea. But within those walls, the story remained alive, of love that turned to obsession, of healing that came too late, of a house forever touched by both the light and the darkness of those who once called it home. Rachel would later tell a friend that she could still feel Luna's presence when the wind blew from the shore. Not as a threat, but as a warning that some loves are too powerful to die quietly, that the line between devotion and destruction is as thin as the sound of a heart breaking in the dark. And as the waves crashed against the rocks below, it almost sounded like laughter, or perhaps like the whisper of someone who refused to be forgotten.